In 2001, Konami released Metal Gear Solid 2, a game perhaps most famous for its early game twist that it would not just be a rehash of Metal Gear Solid 1, shocking players by replacing the already iconic Solid Snake with the comparatively timid and unimposing Raiden. Spoiler alert for pretty much the entire Metal Gear franchise. If you haven't played them yet, you can close this now. But the real gut punch is the secondary twist at the end of the game, where it's revealed that the whole thing actually was a rehash of MGS1, and you, the player, didn't even realize it. Raiden was guided through a set of events directly mirroring the Shadow Moses incident to a T, acting almost as much as a remake as a sequel. It was a meta-commentary on the nature of sequels, the flow of information through generations, how we let technology shape our lives, and other stuff. Like a lot of other stuff that isn't relevant to this video. It's a wild game. The point is, series creator Hideo Kojima, at a time in his life when he was already publicly itching to make something other than Metal Gear, somehow gave us arguably his most divisive and bold title yet, in the form of a game that essentially copied a majority of its beats from the previous one. Of course, in this instance, the similarities are the whole point. I'm definitely not complaining about that. And if you go past the surface level, Metal Gear Solid 2 is very different from anything else in this series, and honestly anything else in the industry. But what does interest me about this is the fact that this was actually the third time that Kojima made a game with essentially the exact same series of events, at least at face value. And I'm not talking about Twin Snakes, which he did not handle himself. In fact, I am saying that Metal Gear Solid itself wasn't even the original template for pretty much this exact experience. Despite being such a groundbreaking game in its own right, Metal Gear Solid lifts a majority of its structure from a little game called Metal Gear 2: Solid Snake. Picture this. Solid Snake has retired to get away from the trauma of his last mission, but Colonel Campbell convinces him to get back in action for one more job. His mission is to save high-profile hostages being held by a mysterious mercenary group. Early on in his attempt to save the hostages, he is accosted by a cyborg ninja, who turns out to be a former ally who was left for dead in the last game. Snake has to meet up with a woman who has already embedded herself undercover with the organization, but the only way to reach her is to call her number on the back of the box. Along the way, you fight a Hind helicopter, and a mysterious caller warns you about Claymore mines, and this turns out to be your old friend Gray Fox. Snake catches up with an undercover soldier by waiting for her to go to the women's restroom, but shortly after teaming up with her, she is severely wounded in a hallway. You later have a drawn-out action sequence in a stairwell, followed by jumping off the roof in style, and you have a fight where 4 men enter an elevator with you and you have to take them all out. You need to change the temperature of a shape memory alloy key to progress, and eventually you fight Metal Gear, followed by a climactic hand-to-hand fight, followed by one last conversation where the big bad hits you with the line, "It's not over yet," and you and your lady friend end it all off with a timed escape sequence before the base is set to explode. Now, despite the playful tone there, none of that was criticism. The late 90s shift to 3D offered ample opportunity to revisit ideas from the 2D era on 64-bit systems, and plenty of franchises took advantage of that. It certainly wasn't just Metal Gear. But when, for a variety of reasons, the third game in the series was titled Metal Gear Solid and not Metal Gear 3, the influence of the original 2 titles kinda got swept under the rug. Their narrative importance is still massive to the overall story, but when people talk about Metal Gear, they usually mean Metal Gear Solid 1 through 5. Even Peace Walker gets a lot more attention than the early games. I'm not making this video to admonish the later games, but instead to take this opportunity to showcase just how massively influential Metal Gear 2 was on the entire gaming industry for a game that, these days, really doesn't get talked about a lot. There are a ton of ideas and concepts that Metal Gear 2 established that became ingrained in the series until its eventual death about a decade ago, and I would argue that the jump from Metal Gear 1 to Metal Gear 2 was a lot bigger than the jump from Metal Gear 2 to Metal Gear Solid. It gave us the Soliton radar, or at least a version of it. It gave us the cone detection system, prone crawling, making noise to distract guards, and the puzzle-esque boss battles the series would become known for, as opposed to whatever the heck the first game was doing. So much of the franchise's mechanical identity comes directly from Metal Gear 2. And the original Metal Gear was a great game, but Metal Gear 2 has one of the most poignant narratives in the franchise, which I can't say about the first one. It explores child soldiers thematically long before MGS5 did. It explores the idea of the scene of the battlefield and how your ally at one moment is your enemy the next, in a way that I would argue hits just as well as MGS3. Characters like Kyle Schneider and Gray Fox were allies in the first game, but they felt they were left with no choice but to follow Big Boss after being left for dead by the very people Snake is siding with. Perhaps most importantly, it was the first game to truly lean on the idea of soldiers banding together in a world that is willing to throw them away, a theme that existed in Metal Gear 1, but really gets fleshed out here and remains at the center of the franchise all the way through Metal Gear Solid 5. It was here that the first inklings of the boss's will and Big Boss's interpretation of it were drafted by Kojima. We would not have the narratives of MGS 3, 4, and 5, and Peace Walker without the narrative setup of Metal Gear 2. A lot of people don't play old games because they believe developers just didn't have the tools to tell compelling stories back then like they can today. And as much as I can understand that, we all have our tastes, I think Metal Gear 2 has one of the most thematically tight narratives in the franchise. It may not have the most interesting cast of side characters or the hour-long cutscenes of the future, but it tells a concise and emotional adventure, and I truly believe Kojima knew he struck gold with Metal Gear 2, and that's why so much of Metal Gear Solid is just the same game again. Far be it from me to pretend I know what's going through a creative's head, but Kojima's constant statements that he would leave Metal Gear behind after every entry starts making more sense when you take the original games into account. While Metal Gear Solid was the introduction to the series for a lot of people, for Kojima it was the third go at a very similar kind of experience that he had been doing for well over a decade. He had already written Snake as older and retired in Metal Gear Solid, and that final ride into the sunset could have easily been the series' last hurrah. He came up with the basic layout for a game with Metal Gear 2. With Metal Gear Solid, he basically did the same thing again in a lot of ways with the narrative and mechanical tools of the PS1. With Metal Gear Solid 2, he did the same thing again, but this time it was a commentary on the fact that he was doing the same thing again, and at that point it's a whole thing. Metal Gear, Metal Gear 2, and Metal Gear Solid arguably tell a more cohesive story together than the Metal Gear Solid games do on their own. These first three games form a trilogy where each one makes clear, stepwise improvements on the last that move in a very linear and understandable direction. By the end of MGS2, Kojima had made 4 games in a row that were variations of the same basic idea, infiltrating enemy territory to save hostages and take out Metal Gear. And that is a very surface-level way to view the games, but it's worth noting that after MGS2, that basic structure got a lot more different with each game. Metal Gear Solid 3 trades out the entire vibe of the previous games for a Cold War spy thriller with in-depth survival mechanics. Metal Gear Solid 4 is a chapter-based cinematic experience that you watch as much as you play, and Metal Gear Solid 5 is a sandbox stealth extravaganza where players can get lost for hundreds of hours. If you go online, you can find quote after quote where Kojima says he is done with the franchise for good this time, only to get sucked right back in. By the time Solid came out, we were over a decade into this thing, and the linearity of MGS as an upgrade over Metal Gear 2 makes it easy to see why Kojima might have been itching for something new. I can see why the game started to go in so many wacky directions after MGS2. Metal Gear Solid and Metal Gear Solid 2 do so many unique things, and yet Metal Gear 2 was such a home run that Kojima was still following that same basic blueprint over a decade after that game came out. Older games aren't for everyone. Some people can't even handle playing PS2 games these days, hence the fact that the upcoming MGS3 remake will most likely attract a lot of new players who otherwise wouldn't have gone back, and that's great. But if you are someone who just hasn't played Metal Gear 2 because you assumed it wouldn't live up to the rest of the series given the fact that no one really talks about it, my call to action of the video would be to encourage you to give it a try. It is basically 2D Metal Gear Solid, but with a totally unique soundtrack and thematic core that may not be as flashy as the later games, but is still just as resonant in my opinion. As revolutionary as Metal Gear 1 was, and as iconic as Metal Gear Solid is, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake is the game that decided what the identity of the Metal Gear franchise would be. It is the Link to the Past, or Symphony of the Night, or Super Metroid of Metal Gear in my opinion. A game that was so dead center on the mark that the rest of the series would use it as a template for decades to come. Now, if you do decide to go and play Metal Gear 2, or if you have played it in the past and you just feel like talking about it, feel free to go ahead and comment down below. I would be happy to chat with you. But all around, that was all I wanted to talk about today. Just a short video on a franchise that I really do care about. For right now, I hope you do have a great day, and take care of yourself.